Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes to let others join, and then we'll begin today's discussion. Okay, I see some folks trickling in. I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the Hunt Institute's Race and Education webinar series, promoting diverse school leader pathways and supports. My name is Jessica Au. I'm a senior policy analyst on our K-12 team at the Hunt Institute. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of logistical notes with you all. Today's conversation will be recorded. It's recording right now. And it'll be posted on our YouTube page for those who want to rewatch later or for folks who can join us. We'll also have an audience Q&A toward the latter portion of the hour. So please submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And at any time during the webinar, feel free to add those questions, and then we'll try to get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A. We also hope that you'll engage with us on Twitter using the hashtag race and education. And then we'll also be live tweeting this conversation from our Twitter account on @HuntK12Ed. We have a great conversation ahead of us. I'm very excited for it. And we're also so appreciative for all of our wonderful panelists today for making time to speak with us about how we can diversify school leadership and also support and retain school leaders of color. And so without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today, Amanda Fernandez, CEO and founder of Latinos for Education. So the floor is yours, Amanda.
Thank you. And buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day. Looks like we've got a great group, but we also have a great panel ahead of us, given the backgrounds and experiences of the folks who are with us today. I will just say a couple of words about who Latinos for Education is, in case you don't know. Latinos for Education, I founded 5 years ago, and our work is dedicated to the development of Latino leaders in education and the retention of teachers who identify as Latinos in education. At the same time, we have a policy side because we believe that policy and practice change need to happen hand in hand. And so we work to advocate to remove barriers to educational opportunity with a focus on Latino children through policy change as well. So again, this is such a timely topic. It always is, because we know we have to consistently be focused on diversifying our leadership pipelines in education. But we know that educators right now, systems leaders, are feeling the impact of the pandemic on the ability to attract folks of color to the profession, to stay in the profession, to pursue leadership positions is on your minds, and it's top of mind, because we are seeing the fatigue, we're seeing some of the challenges that have arisen. In fact, from what I'm hearing from school leaders, and probably many of you who are on this call right now are feeling it as well, that this has probably been, if not the hardest year, one of the hardest years of your profession. So taking that into account, I want to turn it over to the voices who have been doing the work, staying with it, staying with us, staying with our kids. Thank you for all that you do. But now we want to take a moment to talk about your perspective on diversifying pipelines. And so with that, I am going to have each of you make a brief introduction of yourselves and answer a question at the same time. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Spiro, and have you introduce yourself and then answer this question. So in your mind and from your perspective and the work that you do, why is it important to have strong and diverse principal pipelines specifically? And if you could talk a little bit about how some of the districts that you're working with are doing this, would love for you to take a few minutes to talk about that.
Well, thanks so much. It's really an honor to be here and to be with all these amazing people and the heroes who are on the panel and in the audience. So I am Jody Spiro. I direct the education leadership work at the Wallace Foundation. And many of you may know we've been involved with education leadership for the past 22 years and counting, still to come. So currently, just to pick up from where you started, throughout the pandemic, we've been working with 78 districts and in 32 states across the country on the question, the activities engaged in principal pipelines. And now we're still working with the 78, but we're very focused on an initiative with 8 districts, as you mentioned, who are specifically pursuing equity-centered principal pipelines. So I'll answer your question. That was my introduction, and I'll answer your question in 3 short parts. One of them, your question about why equity-centered leaders are important. The second is why pipelines are important. And then very briefly about what our equity-centered, the 8 districts are doing with our equity-centered pipeline initiative. And if you know anything about Wallace, you know that we are very evidence-driven. So everything I'm about to say comes from evidence. And so there was a research synthesis on leadership in 2020. All of this can be found on wallacefoundation.org, which is the commercial. But the wonderful 20-year research synthesis has a lot written up about it on what principles, the role that principals play in advancing equity. And it's a great read, and it talks from an evidence perspective about how principals can improve student achievement at very similar rates to teachers, except that, of course, a principal is for the whole school. That principals set, of course, the school climate and culture and discipline. And principals are very primarily responsible for teacher satisfaction and for student and teacher placement. And what the researchers found is that in more diverse schools that had diverse leaders, students of color were more represented in gifted and talented programs. Students of color had higher attendance, and teachers wanted to work in those schools. And so principals are key for equity. 1. 2, principal pipelines. The RAND study from 2019 of the principal pipeline work documented that districts which had comprehensive aligned principal pipelines, so not just one element or 2, but aligned, raised student achievement, had outperformance in student achievement to a large, statistically significant degree throughout the district. And that extended to the lowest performing schools. So principal pipelines are very important. And so that leads us to equity-centered principal pipelines. How can pipelines combine what we know about equity with what we know about principal pipelines? So the 8 districts in particular are engaging their entire communities in their local community stakeholders, their universities, their states, all the district departments they conducted an equity review that is their baseline. They created altogether definitions of what they mean by equity in their district with their partners, which are living documents. They've defined what they mean by an equity-centered leader, and they've created a vision for this equity-centered pipeline that they're going to spend the next 4 years bringing to fruition and reducing that gap between the vision and the reality. So I hope that was about a little more than 3 minutes to answer all those questions.
It's hard to do that, so no worries. Thank you for that. You know, you said, what I heard was diverse leaders equals students of color faring better in our schools, and we have to have a comprehensive approach to building these pipelines and supporting leaders of color. So with that, Dr. Davis, great to see you. District Superintendent, would love to hear a little bit more about where you're situated and a little bit more about how you're thinking about improving equity in schools. You have an exciting initiative called Premier 100, and it'd be great for you to expand a little bit on that.
Sure thing. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Baron Davis, and I have the honor and privilege of serving the superintendent of Richland School District 2, which is located in Columbia, South Carolina, the northeast section of the city of Columbia. We're about 28,500 students, a little right around 4,000 employees, in a very diverse school system with roughly 62% of our students identifying as students of African descent. About 72% of our population of identified minority students, and about 64% of our students, 54% of our students identify as students who live in low wealth communities, or students of poverty. I tend to try to shy away from that idea of poverty and focus more on the wealth, which is the condition that leads to poverty. But however, we do have a initiative here. I like to call it a movement at this point, because we have been doing it for a couple of years now, and it's called the Premier 100. And the Premier 100 is our focus in our school district to recruit and retain 100 men of color, specifically identifying African-American males as our target audience. However, we do incorporate all men of color into the Premier 100 cohorts in our school district. And this was important for us. One, understanding that for men of color, we operated in a very unique space of our own, a space where as students, we were often either oppressed or mislabeled, marginalized as students. And now here we are working in a space where we were systemically conditioned to believe that we were academically, socially, and emotionally academic, social, emotional deficits as students. And now we're working in that same environment, and we need to make sure that we have individuals in place who kind of understand the importance of the role of not only an educator, but a role of an African-American male educator in every classroom or in classrooms across our state, most specifically across our district, but of course, across the nation. When I look at and think about leadership and the importance of developing African-American leaders or minority leaders in our district, I think it's important for us to look at leadership not as just a destination or position, but really as the action. And for us, that means that everyone has to understand that they have a role to play as a leader in the school district, regardless of what title or position they may hold. So whether they are a bus driver, a custodian, a cafeteria worker, or the superintendent or board member, that they are practicing the tenets of leadership that will create conditions where we can recruit and retain and develop all individuals and hopefully preparing them to be global citizens, particularly as we talk about our students, but more importantly, creating this diverse learning experience, diverse learning experiences for our students in our school district. And so everyone has a role to play in that. But it's important that we start developing these individuals along the pipeline in our school system so that when they do ascend to the role or title of a leader, it's not a new concept for them to be thinking in those terms. Now I'm the principal. Oh, now let me start thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion now that I'm the leader. This needs to be a part of their experience when they were a classroom teacher or let's say a classroom instructional assistant who may have become a classroom teacher who now is an assistant principal and now is the principal. This has been a part of their educational experience all along their pathway. And so it's important that they have this idea or this perception and looking through things through this very social justice kind of leadership lens, where individuals are always constantly focusing on those marginalized groups of students and their experiences. So whether it's race, class, gender, disability, sexual orientation, whatever, that stuff is central to their advocacy as a leader, that they're using those tenets to advocate and remove those systemic institutional barriers that existed for so long out of the way of those students so they can have that premier educational experience that everyone's seeking.
Thank you so much. So important, the work that you're doing. What I heard was through your initiative, what you're really trying to do is to ensure that men of color, African-American males in our school buildings are no longer the exception, but the rule. And I love this idea of leadership as an action and social justice at the center. Because the males you're talking about, their experiences really matter in shaping how children of the future will feel in your school district about their educational journey. So thank you. Dr. Rice Booth, so nice to have you here from the Leadership Academy, good friends of Latinos for Education. So good to see you. So you all recently received a $1.2 million grant to develop resources to support equity officers and school leaders of color. We're all here on this call because we know that we have only about 20% of school principals across the country who are people of color. So would love for you to talk a little bit about how that grant and the work that you all do is supporting the equity that we need to see in our principal pipelines, not only the challenges that you all know principals face, but what you all are doing to support our leaders of color.
Thank you, Amanda. And I wanted to start first by sharing a little bit about who we are, right? So we had our origins in New York City in 2003 when the then Chancellor and Mayor of New York City really wanted to diversify the principalship in the largest district in the country, right? And so I'm a product of the Academy, and we definitely focused on, right, diversifying that group. And since then, we have been able to expand to 37 states across the country and really working with leaders about what does it mean to be a culture responsive leader, and how do I do that in everything that I do and in my actions and my decision making, and bringing and making sure the students and families and communities that we serve are at the center of everything that we do. And so this current grant that we have with Gates is allowing us to just enhance the work that we have already laid as a foundation. And because we know of some of the unique challenges the principals of color face, one being the fact that they mostly lead in urban and high poverty school systems. And that means that they also typically face additional challenges like limited resources. We also know that principals of color have a shorter tenure and lower retention rate than their colleagues, because again, they're working in high poverty and urban school systems. And then we also know that over the past 2.5, feels like 3-5 years, who knows, that leading through a pandemic, leading through a racial reckoning, leading through the pushback and the trauma associated with the anti-CRT movement. A lot of leaders of color have become the face and the voice of much of the political tensions that they are experiencing. They're experiencing nationally, and it's become personal. And so some of the tools of support that we see that are necessary for principal of colors to be able to maintain and retain and be successful and thrive in their roles is to have a team approach, right? So recognizing the fact that leading cannot be done alone or in isolation. And so really ensuring that the leader has more than just, it's not just themselves that are leading, but they have folks around them that they're working in collaboration with. The second tool of support that we want to really lay out here is mentorship, right? And so a lot of times a principal of color could be considered the first in some districts, or it could definitely be an isolating role. And so being able to have a mentor and particularly a mentor that has been in a similar seat, in a similar situation, is really key to that. Also investing in professional development. So we know that principals of color are more likely than their white counterparts to have served as assistant principals before moving into the principal role. And unfortunately, assistant principals do not receive a same level of professional development and professional learning to be able to move into that professional, into that principal role. So really making sure that they have that support and professional learning. And then the biggest one, which is connected to our Gates grant, is this creating a network of support. Right. So again, being able to be in a space that is of healing, that's of care, where you don't have to code switch, where you can be in a space where people get it and understand what you're going through, has been extremely instrumental. And so for us, we're excited about being able to, we have our first cohort that's in the middle, that are being trained as facilitators. And just an example, our recent conversation, we talked about the shooting in Uvalde, Texas, and just we were able to, we found out about that during our session. And we were able to really unpack what does it mean to lead through such a crisis, and how do we be supportive of each other? What are some lessons learned? Because again, unfortunately, this is not the first shooting that our principals have led through. And then also, like, how do I also take care of myself at the same time that I'm taking care of my community? And so those are some a really key point of that. And so we're excited to the fact that as of July 1st, we'll be supporting over 250 principals of color through our network, and making sure that they feel loved and cared for and supported, and feel connected to others who are in the work with them.
Thank you so much. We know that factor of feeling the support and having the network and getting the support you need is probably number one for leaders of color, beyond financial aspects, et cetera. So thank you all for the work that you do. Dr. Daniel, great to have you here. Principal and senior fellow at the National Association of Elementary School Principals and Center for Diversity and Leadership. So you certainly have firsthand understanding of what school leaders, what the experience needs to be like for our school leaders of color. So would love for you to say a little bit more about the work that you're doing and talk a little bit about the impact of diverse leadership on students and staff, and how school leaders can support and empower educators of color to move into leadership positions. I'm very interested in hearing your perspective on that. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, and good afternoon, everyone. So very exciting times. This is actually the last day of school for my school district. So very excited to be here. You know, as a leader of color and serving in a school district that is about 90%, you know, Black and brown children, it has been very important for students to have a mirror and a window, so to speak, at school. And for me, my school district in Prince George County Public Schools, I am actually a product of Prince George County. And so for me, I remember always seeing leaders that looked like me, teachers that looked like me, and that had such an impact on my academic outcomes, my emotional outcomes, and then ultimately my career outcomes. And I think it's important for students and staff to have leaders of color, to have diversity within leadership, because it gives them an opportunity to kind of see themselves reflected in other perspectives, for students to have a mirror of, someone that looks like them in a leadership position, somebody that, to say that they know a doctor, right? To say that they know a woman leader that, lives in the same neighborhood as them. And it ultimately helps them have better academic experiences and outcomes. But then also I'm able to have connections with students and families that are very different than my counterparts that may not serve a school that they look like. And I think that has ultimately helped just increase that climate and culture, especially in these last 3 years, right? Where we have been having so many different pandemics that we have been experiencing, and to be able to connect with families in a way that is safe, where they feel heard. As Dr. Rice said, we don't have to code switch. Like, they understand. I understand their walks, where they're coming from. And then for our students, I'm really able to improve some of those emotional outcomes where they have been underrepresented in districts or in school leaders. And so now they are able to see people sitting in leadership positions that they know, that they can speak with, that can have a connection with. And then, principals who support and reflect students' identities can also influence student outcomes by working with teachers on culture responsive teaching, hiring teachers of colors, having practices that positively influence all students, at job fairs or hiring fairs, being able to connect with students of color, graduates, and finding out their passion, their why, and hearing that they want to serve in school communities, that they feel that they need to have people that look like them, that understand their backgrounds, their walks of life. And then for my staff, we're able to kind of have that tap on their shoulder as the reasons of entering education. I just took a picture with one of my first year teachers who just finished her first year of teaching. And she stated that, just having someone that understood, her walk of life has truly been an impact on her having a successful first year. And, as a leader of color, I'm able to impact the next generation of students that come in, the next generation of leaders. And then at the national level, we're able to increase that voice of diverse leadership, and then helping other leaders understand how to promote diversity within their schools, how to celebrate it, how to retain, to have those sometimes uncomfortable conversations with their staff members.
Thank you so much. It was so important you're mentioning that communities of color are dealing with multiple pandemics, and that really matters. That's why it matters even more so that we have diverse leadership in our schools, from everything that you've just said. So thank you for that. And this importance of mirrors and windows, I think that's just a great metaphor for what we aspire to have for our students. So I'm going to turn the new line of questioning to pivot a little to the policy space, because we know that the practice change is happening with you all. Would love your perspectives on the policy change that's needed. And the question will go to all of you to briefly respond to this question on the policy levers that you believe exist for education leaders at the local and state level to enact to better attract, support, and retain school leaders of color. So would love for you to give your perspective on that, and any strategies that you've come across. I will just say that one thing that Latinos for Education is doing here in Massachusetts, where I'm from, is we've introduced the Educator Diversity Act to the legislature to ensure that there are a number of items that have a policy and regulatory aspect to them so that our state leaders are held accountable to participating in this work of removing barriers. So along those lines, would love to hear, and I'll start with you, Dr. Spiro, to talk a little bit about the policy levers you think are available.
Thank you so much. I just have to say, Dr. Daniel, before I begin, how moved I am by you and by what you've said, and just whether there's a connection here or not, but I suspect that you are a primary result of the principal pipeline work in Prince George's County that I was talking about before, like a living, breathing, amazing hero. And I'm very moved by it. So thank you so much. In terms of policy levers, and I would recommend to everybody, RAND just last week published a report that is an evaluation of our university principal prep initiative. It's so new that I didn't have an opportunity to give it to the Hunt Institute as a reference. They go into policy levers, and so I will just give you 5. And I think the number one policy lever is, not that I think, I mean, again, evidence, are leader standards. And so one of the activities that Wallace is currently sponsoring is for the National Policy Board for Education Administration to be working with NAESP and other groups all around the country to develop within the professional education leader standards a real building out of standard number 3, which is the equity standard for leaders. And as a policy lever, the professional leader standards have, every state now has some form of leader standards, and 24 states have adopted or adapted the PSEL standards. And it's a real driver of the following: of licensing of principals, major policy lever. Tied to that, the ability of states and professional organizations to accredit preparation programs. So let's stop having preparation programs that get their accreditation based on how many hours you sit in a seat, and instead have a preparation program around the skills and knowledge that you need to be able to be a successful equity-centered leader. Couple of others is performance evaluation. So is what principals are evaluated on in the district the same thing as what they've been trained to do? And where's that alignment? The opportunity, I think Dr. Rice Booth spoke about, the opportunity for professional development as a policy lever. I don't know how many of us have thought of it as a policy lever, but mentoring, and programs for APs, and a new report just again last week from LPI, which talked about things are getting better, but that the access that APs and aspiring leaders have to really high quality prep programs is inequitable. And depending on where you are, usually in wealthier areas, people have access to different quality of programs. So there's still inequitable distribution about that. And the last thing I would mention, just because it seems to be relevant to what my fellow panelists have been talking about, is in everything we do with principal pipelines, university prep, equity-centered pipelines, the districts, the universities develop what is called a leader tracking system. They call it different names, and there's one in Prince George's County. And it is a way to, an online basis to be able to identify high potential folks based not on who you know, but based on what you bring, and follow you throughout your career of what you've done, what credentials you have, and eventually be able to match you to the best fit and match where you would be most successful as an assistant principal or a principal. And so it's breaking the culture of who you know with what you can demonstrate are your skills and knowledge. Leader tracking systems based on data.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very comprehensive. Dr. Davis, can you speak a little bit to this policy lever that is on your mind that could be enacted?
Well, I can speak from just from my level as in my position, I should say, in the organization. And so I wanted to ask that our board adopt an equity policy for the school district. That's going to be the greatest impact I can have as superintendent on the school system, is that we actually have a policy that we don't just talk about equity and diversity and inclusion, that we actually have a policy that we're governed to follow, a policy that we're governed by with a set of administrative rules, but it really puts the philosophical ideas of equity and the importance of equity into writing, into something that my administrators can follow, something that my teachers can follow, but also it's important to communicate to our community and to those who support our school system and that are part of our school system, that we are serious about the work of equity in the school district. The policy then gives you latitude as administrators to do the work that you need to do without necessarily having to then justify or being questioned. Because let's make no mistakes about it, in many parts of the country, as our colleagues are doing this work, there's tremendous amount of pushback and backlash, and challenges and barriers and roadblocks that are continually placed in front of them. We still have colleagues in this country who can't say equity, diversity, and inclusion, who are afraid to say, I'm doing this for Black and brown children, who are afraid to say BIPOC, and all these types of things in an education center, who are afraid to talk about LGBTQ students and the needs of those students, who literally are paralyzed and avoid having those difficult conversations and challenge around this topic. So of course you get people like us who are all courageous and willing to do that work and are out front, but this is a very small minority of individuals who are willing to do this work, regardless of the system that they're currently in. I've been in systems where the majority of students have been African-American and the majority of students are in poverty, and they're still afraid to say those things in those communities because of what the community at large will say. And so we not to have some sort of guidance that we can have in place. And so I would encourage people to look in your school district and see if an equity policy exists. And if an equity policy doesn't exist, how do you begin to have start having the conversation around the creation of an equity policy and an administrative rule, so that when you're not there, or the next principal comes in, or the next teacher comes in, there's something that governs the work that you all are supposed to do. When board members are elected, there's something that governs the work that you are doing in this area. No different than we have policy against discrimination, policies against matriculation through the educational experience of students from elementary, middle to high. We have policies that govern those things. I think some work as important as equity and diversity and development of leaders and all those things, I think that work needs to be a part of, should be supported by policy in your school districts.
Thank you for that, and for painting the reality of what the challenges really are. We have to always acknowledge there's a reality that we're all trying to navigate against. So thank you. So Dr. Rice Booth, if you can jump in here and provide your perspective on policy.
Yeah. First of all, just kind of double click on both of the thing that Dr. Spiro said around leadership pipeline and support around that work and professional development. That needs to be part of that policy, right? So ensuring that there's monies and time set aside, and adequate funding to really be able to build out your leadership pipelines. Something Dr. Davis just said was around the idea of policy. And I would say the first part of that policy needs to be recognition that the system was not designed to support, first, not designed to support the Black and Brown students that are coming through our doors every day, but also not designed to support the Black and Brown leaders that are coming through, the adults, right? We were kids first in the system. Now we're adults in this system, and the system is not designed for us to be successful, right? So there needs to be recognition of that, and recognition of how so many times we are losing our really strong leaders because we're being considered or wanting to be magical beings. We're being asked to do all of these things on top of our job, right? Because we're supposed to be, we as teachers, we get all the kids, the problem kids that are coming into our classrooms. We're considered the deans, the culture builders, right? We're being asked to lead the equity teams, right? All of this on top of our day-to-day role. And so how are we actually creating spaces and places for our leaders to be able to do their job, number one, and be able to then be successful and be taken care of in that way. And then the last thing that I will say is recognition. And last week I was just talking to a group of equity officers in for-profit spaces, and they are the same. They are recruiting and wanting folks of color in their organizations as well, and they're looking for high qualified college graduates of color. So we are in competition, right? For many folks who are recognizing that the value of diversity, of staff diversity, right? So how are we actually creating competitive pay with loan forgiveness, so that we are actually being able to recruit high quality educators into our system and keep them in our system.
Yeah, very important point. Dr. Daniel, can you weigh in on the policy side?
Yes, absolutely. So just definitely to echo what everyone before me said, but I think part of the problem is that diversity and inclusion are sometimes lumped together, and they're assumed to be like the same thing, but they're not. And diversity is almost like being invited to the party, but inclusion is like being asked to dance, right? And so I think that we need to do more of just kind of wanting to have a diverse workforce or having, leaders of color or people in this space, but then are they included? Are their voices included in the conversation? Are they at the table making the decisions, or are they just placeholders? One thing that we have in Prince George County Public Schools is that we have equity leads in each school. And so these equity leads kind of help create these conversations, but then there's a department of diversity and equity that kind of tailors and gives information, helps with a lot of the professional development. So it starts from the top, but it has to be seen at every level. So we can't just kind of have those placeholders of people to say that we kind of check the boxes. We have our African American leader in this place, right? We have some representation of our LGBTQ plus community, but like, are they a part of the conversation of how we're enhancing the climate and culture for our students? Because I think when I think about hiring fairs, and the conversations that I have with teachers, they're looking for places where they feel safe, right? And so the hiring practices, the conversations, the questions that we ask teachers when we are, when we're deciding if they are a best fit for our school are really important, and they have to be strategic to kind of understand what types of staff members you are putting in front of students. Very quickly, I remember having a conversation with hiring a teacher or interviewing a teacher, and I asked her why she wanted to teach at my school. And she said, well, I want to save all of the students. And so my question and my pushback was, well, why do you think they need saving? What part of that do you understand? And so it's being comfortable as a leader to have that conversation and push teachers or prospective teachers for your school community, because had that teacher been in my school community, I wonder what type of climate and culture she would have set in her classroom for those students. You know, how would she look at them? Would it be a constant, you know, a deficit lens of what they were capable of doing? Because in her mind, she felt that she needed to save them. And so again, it's just having those conversations and making sure that the spaces are there, people are there for us to not just be diverse, but also that everyone feels included in the conversation and policies as well.
That's right. So important, the inclusivity part. So we've got some questions from our participants. So I'm going to ask a few of those questions. Probably not have all of you answer, so that maybe we can get a couple of you answering one question and a couple of you answering another. And that's probably going to be all we have time for today. We'll see if we can squeeze another one in. But I'll actually direct this and start with you, Dr. Rice-Booth, to answer this question about some of the programs, to get into a little bit more of a description of the programs or structures that are being created to support more diverse pipelines. You talked about cultural competence and other areas that the Leadership Academy addresses, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about sort of programmatically what might be things that other districts could take on.
Sure. I think one approach I've seen districts use is a grow your own approach, right? And so looking at employees from multiple different areas. So not just looking at teachers' aides or not just looking at teachers, but also looking at other areas of the system where adults may be interested in, community organizers, right? We have students, you know, folks in nutrition or in busing, and right, they just may have an interest in being able to, that's where they are right now, but they may have an interest in being in a leadership role. So really thinking beyond just those, the traditional route of doing pipeline work, I think is one piece. I think another piece, and this goes back to the work of the Wallace Foundation, is really thinking about what is the partnerships that we're having with colleges and universities, particularly HBCUs, right? And so are we intentionally working with those colleges in our area and creating pipelines from that level as well? And the last one I'll say is that I've also have seen districts connected to the Grow Your Own is also, again, thinking about focusing actually on from the high school level, right? And having high school teacher leader programs. And again, also putting a little bit of a thought into their head, like this is your teacher leader, you know, teacher opportunity. But again, also thinking about, can I move into the leadership role after having my time as a teacher as well?
Thank you. That's so important. There is an exciting movement toward the Grow Your Own and sort of reaching back into our high schools. I think another mechanism that I see a lot of promise in is early college programs. I haven't seen as many, though, directed at a teacher pipeline. They're more for other fields. So that'd be one thing I'd like to see more of. And if you all know of programs that are along those lines, that'd be a great resource to share with our audience. I think you may have answered a little bit about one of the other questions that was about if you're in a rural setting where it's just a lot harder to bring in the diverse talent you want from a teacher and leader perspective, that reaching back into the pipeline in your own community might be a good mechanism. But I wonder if others have other perspectives on sort of the rural question, which is often a challenge. And sort of along with that, when there's not as much diversity and you are the diverse person, how do you bring these conversations up about wanting to take on this type of work within a district setting? So I'm going to open it up to one of you to take on that question. Whoever wants to jump in.
I'll step in. Just there was another question that was a bit related from Atlanta, just to put the point on the table that I think we all have to get used to the idea that the district is not alone, and it's not the district's problem alone to solve, and that a lot of the only way this is really going to work is through partnerships and through the districts we work with speak all the time about if they don't have enough diverse candidates, they reach into the local community organizations who work with all kinds of different folks, and they create these partnerships. For the rural districts, again, you've got to change your mindset, right? The rural districts we've worked with create consortia among the rural districts. And so you've got, 42 districts in Western Kentucky that have formed a consortium and worked together, and 12 in North Carolina. And so I think the reason I wanted to respond to that question was about changing our mindset, where we are part of a larger community, and it's not just the school, it's not just the district. It means engaging other districts, community organizations, universities, and that's, by the way, a different muscle. Dr. Davis, particularly, have superintendents been developed to lead these kind of consortia with other districts and with community organizations? Seems to be a bit of a new muscle.
Yeah, it'd be
I would-
great.
Yeah,
Yes, please.
I would add to that, particularly for the question that was related to Atlanta. I think I saw the Atlanta question as well. I think we gotta get out of this idea that leadership is simply being a principal, assistant principal, and superintendent. I'm telling you, there's not enough. There's not enough of us. 80% of the teaching force are white women. It has been that way for a long, long time. It's not enough of us. So one, we need the idea of the co-conspirator needs to definitely be amplified and magnified, where everyone is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Everyone is committed to creating premier educational experiences for students and removing barriers that have marginalized groups of students, whether they're Black, brown, special education, LGBTQ, whatever you want to call, whatever it is, poverty, students of poverty have been marginalized for years. How we develop our courses, who gets access to AP and who gets access to opportunity, how we look at gifted and talented in our states. There are so many places to start. So everyone doesn't have to jump in and jump right on. Let's jump on, Black males and boys and things like that. There's so many areas that we can jump in your area of expertise. And I say that to say this is that by showing those efforts, then you may create a space where men of color or may want to come and be a part of that. But if they think the institution that they're going to come in and simply be the disciplinarian and what I call the Black boy whisperer, they're always going to get the grade level classes, and the principal doesn't have the courage to say, I'm going to send you to AP training. I want you to teach AP African-American history or AP literature or whatever it may be, and we're just going to keep relegating them to the same courses over and over and over again. So we all have a role to play in that. One area that I often share that I think is underrepresented when we're talking about leadership and in education is the need for school psychologists of color. And so just think about the scenario. I don't know about you, but in my district, there are very few Black males who are school psychologists. I have more Black male teachers. I have a good percent, about 7%, which is 3 times the national average. And that's through an effort through things like Premier 100. But Black male school psychologists, well, why is that important? You think there's a cultural mismatch when it comes to Black boys and Black boys being disproportionately placed in special education? And then who's the person that's evaluating the behavior? Well, the reference of that behavior comes from a very homogeneous group of teachers. Typically, white female teachers are referencing this behavior. But as a Black male, I have a cultural understanding of maybe what this kid is going through and don't necessarily see that as something that should place the child in the special education. But with the absence of that, I'm going off of my own cultural experiences if I'm a white, young school psychologist and and this kid is being referred to me from a veteran white female teacher, I'm filtering this action and what I think is appropriate behavior through my cultural experiences. So there's a lot of places we can use leadership in addressing this pipeline of leaders that have this cultural understanding. And that's one of the areas I think we just kind of gloss over a little bit, but could have a huge impact in the educational experience of all students as well as the teachers in the classroom.
Sure. It's more than just the teacher that we need the diversifying of who's in our buildings, serving in different roles. Dr. Daniel, I wonder if we just have maybe a couple more minutes, but there's some important questions in the chat that I think you already talked about a little bit, but if you could expand on this idea of how you coach, what is the conversation like that you had with that teacher who saw you as their model? Well, what about the educator of color who is in a predominantly white school system? How is that the same or different in terms of how you coach, how you support that leader in terms of their own leadership within maybe these different potential scenarios that we're talking about here?
I think it's different and it's the same when you're in different types of populations. One of the things with this particular teacher, my coaching with her was just like, I remember being in your position. I remember being in your seat. And so I'm empathizing with her, not saying, oh, I know it's a first year, but like, I understand the role that you have been in. And so kind of coming off of the high horse and being on the same level for her to understand, like, I'm in the trenches with you. Like, we're going to get through this together. And I think a lot of the times, no matter what type of environment a particularly first year teacher is in, it's just that they feel that somebody has their back, that they have someone that is going to be there to kind of support them and coach them, that if they make the mistake, that conversation does not make them feel less than, but like, okay, let's reflect from this, what can we do differently next time when this experience happens again? And then particularly with the teacher that is serving in a school population that is not a mirror for them, it's getting to understand that, kind of talking about what Dr. Davis said, of making sure that they don't allow themselves to fall into that place of, okay, the 5 or 6 Black students only come to your classroom, or when you're having an irate parent, well, we know she can handle it, or if there's a student that is misbehaving, that student is going to always go to that teacher, but allowing them to see all that you are able to do. But then also understanding that kids are kids, and they just want to feel a connection with someone, that they want to feel safe. Just last week, one of my 6th graders, in his finals farewell speech, he said the great thing about our school community is that no matter what you are, who you are, or where you came from, there's somebody here for you, right? There's somebody that they feel connected to, so you don't have to feel alone. And it's making sure that those teachers understand that they create that culture. They create their climate of their classroom that eventually then trickles into the rest of the school.
Yeah, it speaks to that idea that diverse educators and leaders have positive impact on all students, particularly on kids of color, but on white students as well. So that's a really good point you made. I know we're at the end. I can't believe it. But you all have been amazing. Thank you for your time today. Jessica, I think you might be closing us out today, but it's been a great 1 hour that went too fast.
Time really flew for this conversation, I have to say. Thank you so much, Amanda. And I'd like to thank again, Dr. Spiro, Dr. Davis, Dr. Rice Booth, and Dr. Daniel for joining us for today's engaging and informative conversation. And once again, thank you, Amanda, for moderating and leading our conversation. Before closing today's discussion, I do want to turn everyone to our upcoming K-12 webinars briefly. Our next conversation, very much related, will be on Thursday, July 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern, where we'll be hearing from educators as they share their stories about why they decided to leave their profession as educators and school leaders. as well as a discussion on how states are working to increase support for educators in order to boost retention and really rebuild the educator workforce. And so we'll drop the registration link to this webinar in the chat. We hope you'll join us. We also encourage you to join us for our other upcoming K-12 webinars listed on the screen. You can register for these discussions by going to our website, which we'll post in the chat as well. And so thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you all.